It's not uncommon after losing a loved one to feel strangely connected to the world. For some reason, in that dark time, everything seems more intense, more alive. Leaves floating in the wind can be deeply moving somehow. In Ghost of Tsushima, you, as Jin Sakai, experience the loss of your parents, but you find their presence in nature, in the wind and the animals that guide you. Open world games often feel lifeless, in part because they make you stare at an interface for guidance. Here, the world itself is your guide, and the team at Sucker Punch created a world that's so beautiful it's a little bit surreal. You feel this world breathe, and as you do, you empathize with Jin as his connection to nature changes him. He becomes more in tune with his intuition and emotions, and as a result, he slips further away from the rigid samurai code of honor. This is such a compelling premise. It's so out of place in a AAA open world game. The art direction does this vision justice with lush landscapes and vibrant color palettes. The soundtrack is outstanding as well. Compare it to the Sekiro soundtrack, which is so forgettable it felt like they just defaulted to traditional Japanese music. Ghost of Tsushima's soundtrack feels genuinely inspired by Japanese nature and history, and by the passionate personal conflicts of this story. As a whole, this game resonated with me almost immediately. 30 minutes in, I was surprisingly optimistic. But sadly, on the other side of this amazing premise is just another generic open world game. The idea of guidance within the world is the perfect setup for exploration that maintains a sense of mystery. They could have come up with tons of different surprising ways to subtly guide you toward points of interest. Some of these ways already exist. You follow birds and foxes, you listen for cricket sounds. They could have delivered the experience of wonder when you notice something strange and decide to investigate it. Instead, they delivered the experience of marking a point on your map, like every other open world game, and noticing other hints along the way that serve no purpose because you already know where you're going. The combat in Ghost of Tsushima feels nice and smooth, but it is not good gameplay. When designing a gameplay system, it's important to consider the weight of each mechanic. Think about the amount of value you're getting out of it and make sure it's worth taking up extra space in the player's head. You want to minimize the number of mechanics, but maximize the number of surprising interactions between those mechanics. Ghost of Tsushima continuously adds new mechanics. It felt like I was playing an MMO with dozens of abilities, and a fighting game with a bunch of combos to memorize at the same time. And these abilities barely interact with each other at all. They're used as shiny new toys to keep you interested and distract you from the lack of depth. Even worse, when you finally get past all the awkward fumbling and manage to remember all the controls, they pretty much replace the basic sword fighting. That entire melee combat system goes to waste. Same with the stealth system, you get to a point where you can just blow everything up all the time. Of course, it is possible to have gameplay where the appeal comes from somewhere other than the system itself. The Last of Us Part 2 is a good example. Its gameplay works because of the level design, the environments, the types of enemies, where the enemies are placed. It creates situations where you're scrambling around thinking about how to use these spaces to get the most value out of your tools. But here it's always just a mob of enemies to cut through, and your strongest tools work about the same in every situation. I won't go into all the other activities like climbing. None of them are terrible, but none of them are special either. The big picture of the story is good, but it's hard to be invested in it when it's so drawn out with these totally uninteresting sub-stories. Most of the missions feel like running errands, and there is way too much dialogue during these errands. The intro conveys the themes in this nice simple way, then for the next 25 hours the dialogue clumsily attempts to hammer it home. There were still some memorable moments, and the ending still had some impact, but it could have been a lot better. It seemed like they were on their way to somehow pulling a little piece of humanity out of this cold, lifeless genre, but at some point the game design autopilot kicked in. As far as generic AAA open world games go, Ghost of Tsushima is one of the best, but at the end of the day, I'm just not down for these games where you slowly turn into a vegetable while repeating a few boring, shallow activities for 20 to 50 hours. I wanted to see Ghost of Tsushima rise above that description entirely. I'm giving it a 4 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Press R2 to pay respects.